technology, it probably predates computer technology by quite a few years. And it started off with things more than 100 years ago around the X-ray and the evolution of the X-ray. And that's when we started to get excited about the role technology might have. And I've just put in a few time points, like the first ECG was in 1926. The first pacemaker was put in Kalinska in 1958. And interestingly enough, the guy who got it outlived the guy who put it in for him. He lived to be 86. And that's pretty impressive for the first generation of a technology that actually keeps you alive. And then, of course, things started to break open in the late 1970s and early, and the very last part of the last century. Of course, the first computer is, depending on how you define that, the mechanical computer was 1942, so that's kind of a little bit slower than that. But around in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, we start to see this merging between computer technology, mostly based around the transistor, and medical technology used for diagnosis and treatment of various diseases and disorders. And so this evolving role of technology in medicine is quite curious. I mean, first of all, we had these tools that would assist the doctor, and within 20, 30, 40 years, it started to get to the point where they couldn't deliver without having this technology. And then it's really moved into this area where it's critical for outcome success. In other words, you're not going to have a successful diagnosis or treatment if you don't have medical technologies to support that. And we're getting close to the point where we're moving into what might be the final big area of this, is where it becomes part of the decision-making process. It's kind of happened in a little few areas. We're somewhere in between those gaps. So instead of the doctor making a decision about what treatment you need or what your diagnosis is, it could be a computer or a device or something else. And that will happen. It'll just be very slow to happen. It'll be a little bit like autonomous vehicles or speech recognition. The nearer you get to that point, the harder it is to get that last bit. And that will happen. And that, in some ways that's exciting, but it's also quite scary. But I think we need to be aware of it and look at how it fulfills. And if we look at this idea, they talk a lot about precision medicine. I mean, intuitive medicine will never disappear. This is where your doctor will ask about your symptoms and then try and come up with a logical deduction about what your disease is. But we already know that there's not enough symptoms to go around for all the diseases and the sub-disease states that we can have. And that developed over the last 50, 60, 70 years into what they call empirical medicine, where the doctor says, well, we treated the last 300 patients like this, so we're going to give them that treatment. And for me, with a background in engineering and science, that's a big giant step, because it shows you that art part of medicine, because no treatment I've ever seen in medicine treats 100% of patients and gets 100% of positive results. Whereas in engineering, you tend to think things are black and white. They either work or they don't work. The test either works or it doesn't work. And that's a leap of faith in itself. But it's a step forward. It's better than just the symptom evidence. It's more data evidence for what you're doing. And then we moved into what we call the technological enabler, where you can actually precisely diagnose and precisely treat. You give the example of angioplasty here. You know that the vessel is blocked. You know you can put a physical device in to remove the blockage, and voila, the patient is a hell of a lot better and improves very, very dramatically. And in fact, we're talking about that next step, which related to the last slide, which is where the technology is a driver. So the technology is more of a driver for the treatment, for the diagnosis and treatment of the patient, and that's, if you like, the scary step. And then if we subcategorize, it's important to look at the different areas of technology. It's not just diagnosis and therapy, it's what I call care and maintenance as well. And care can be ongoing care for people who are sick or semi-sick. And maintenance can be where they need something to keep them at a certain threshold, and it's distinctly different in my view than care itself. And of course, traditionally, this came from hospitals and healthcare facilities, and that's where we base the technologies around that. But as we see, this is starting to break out into other areas, and you start to see the GPs and health clinics providing a lot of facilities and maybe doing very sophisticated tests right up to x-rays, blood tests that they wouldn't have done before, and that started to evolve over the last 20, 25 years. Of course, people will tell you there's a whole other area that's really breaking out here. It's the idea of home and work, having your treatment either at home or at work, and the idea that we can use all these the very latest technologies in Wi-Fi, internet access, Bluetooth, and things like near-field communication. And what we're starting to see, what's interesting if you look at particularly things like smartphones now, just in the last couple of years, you start to see a lot of tests that were maybe invented over 10 years ago as games or tricks on smartphones to do things like check your ECG or blood pressure. They're actually getting medical device validation now, so they're actually confirmed as devices that will work properly and can be used in the environment. So that adds a whole other equation into this scenario, and becomes intricate but interesting. Well, I just thought that one of the things that we need to bear in mind, and it was related to a talk I saw a few days ago, this idea that for people, we tend to be that the younger people are the more tech savvy, but it's actually the older people who need the care. So we need to be careful that we don't over-design things. We can design all these fancy iPad and smartphone technologies, but the people who really need them will never use them. We had some students working on projects in Trinity lately, and they did very careful interviews with older people about using technology. And instead of giving them an app for their phone, they built it into things like their working frames and that, so they could use things to open doors. It sounds very simple, but it has to be very practical. Of course, this curve will shift forward as in the next 20, 30, 40 years, but don't remember, there'll probably be a new wave of technology and a new wave of changes coming behind that. So that concept is very interesting. And the idea that we should think about systems, incorporate systems thinking. I mean, I work a lot in the hospital. I'm responsible for employing new medical technologies. And you can't anymore, you can't just talk about what the technology is. It could be a new machine for surgery or whatever. You have to fit it into the scheme and the system of things. We don't think like that very often. Usually it's connected to the communication in the hospital, the patient record, for example, or information thing. That's an important part of it, but also how it fits into the process. If you can bring in the very best technology to treat a new disease, and if you don't actually implement it properly in the process, it may not be of any benefit at all, or it may take a long time to have traction. So the idea of including process and designing process, and if you're a company or a designer, if you don't factor these things in, particularly in your early stage of your development, it could be the difference between the life or death of your product. I mostly talk about technology and devices. That's my area, but it is of course related to pharmacology and what we call hybrids, which are pharmaceutical delivery devices, or actually medical technology or devices themselves. So this idea of bringing new ideas, inventing them, innovating them, and making new products, and what's the difference in medical devices and ICT? Well, I think there are quite differences. If you look at the evolution of devices traditionally, the idea may come from a university, a group, or it may come from an inventor or entrepreneur. It usually incubates in a startup. The startup may even get right down to putting products on the market, but it never becomes commonly used until it's spun out by a multinational, and the multinational generally gets it to the bedside. It may go from the bedside to here, but it's important to understand that these guys are setting up these companies so that they can get rich selling them to multinationals. And that's not a bad model, and it works quite well, but it's worth being aware of it, because for my money it's quite different than how you see developments in some areas of information and communication technology. I'm particularly talking about information and communication technology that relates to the devices. There's a whole other world of information systems in hospital which isn't covered by this, and that's a whole deal in itself. So if you look at the environment for ICT companies, well, you have software and diagnosis. It's designed for diagnosis and treatment, and that tends to model very much how the devices themselves are evolved, like the previous slide. But app development is a huge, interesting area. You'll see people go out into the world and develop app, and if you look at how the app world develops, it often doesn't involve intellectual property. It's often people in a back office somewhere. They come up with a really good idea, they launch it on the market. They don't worry too much about whether it's very well developed or thought out. And then they might see an application in medicine, and that's not, you can't just transfer that automatically. It's a whole different world, and it's a whole different way of developing that. Also, just the idea of systems design, that tends to be mostly with multinationals, or you see more SMEs involved in that. And of course, huge area, data analytics, the idea of data mining, using big data sets to analyze the context of samples and testing and results, and whether patients are healthy or well. That's a huge area as well. So this is quite a different model for innovation in ICT than we get from medical devices. And for me, I think the big question here is about this area of risk and failure. And if you look at from a failure perspective, the mobile apps, I mean, you just accept they're going to fail, and they just bring out another version of them. So if you're developing mobile apps in the wild world, developing that model into medicine where the failure is really, failure is not an option when you get into diagnosing a patient or keeping a patient record. Data analytics, well, that's not necessarily an issue, because if it's a calculation. If it fails, you just repeat it, modify it and repeat it. But assistant design is very, very important because it has to be validated and debugged, and it may still have errors in it, but and that's acceptable. But if you're using software for diagnosis and treatment, failure is really not an option. It has to be as perfect as it can be, or at least if it fails in such a way that it doesn't cause harm. And that can be very, very challenging. And people, particularly if they transit from the ICT world into the medical device world, find it difficult to cope with some of these issues and to bring these things to the fore. And so that's, and give it priority. Just very briefly to talk about some of my own experience in the area. This is a technology for measuring valves in the GI tract. So you can pass a small catheter into what's a valvular region and make cross-sectional area measurements. It uses a technique known as impedance planimetry. It's basically impedance to measure area. Here it is measuring the valve at the top of your stomach that stops heartburn or reflux disease. These are some early generations of that. And I suppose my perspective, my background again being an engineer, I tend to look at all these squiggly lines and wonder how, decipher information and generate statistics on them. But we very early on, well, at the time we didn't call it data visualization, but really what we wanted to do was to create a visual image of this so that it could be used in medicine quicker and easier. And so what we did was we come up with these color contour images looking at building a geometric profile through valvular regions. And you can see very easily that this is a normal patient, and this is a patient with a restricted or tight valve. And you can see that it very clearly demonstrates those differences. And of course that's much easier than having this in the hospital, having to analyse the data and then send the result to the doctor. The doctor can actually tell that information live. And so that was commercialised by a company in Galway. The product's called EndoFlip, and you can see there, you can see these live images. It's still storing the core data, but you can see the live data on the machine. And then here's an example of it being used in Strasbourg in France intraoperatively. So they're doing a myotomy, a muscle cut for surgery, and they can actually stage the procedure and see the changes that they're making live on screen. So relatively speaking, a simple technology, but has very practical uses. And of course, it's actually been a very successful technology, and it's won a number of awards, and it has recognition in the world. So out of that experience, I've got involved with the Innovation Academy in Trinity College Dublin, and there we try to teach students how to transfer these core skills that they have by teaching them how to ideate and potentially become entrepreneurs in various areas of business and work. That started off as a PhD program. We've developed programs for undergraduates and for academics themselves in the way that they teach innovation and entrepreneurship, because it's quite distinctly different than many of the other programs that they teach. And more recently, we've developed an executive level program. So we've actually taken what we've learned teaching PhD students, and we've started to apply it to the executive world. And we've taken in fairly high level executives over a short program. And what we teach them to do is to really look differently at their own workplace. Here's the Provost of Trinity launching the program last year. We're running it again this year. And we talk about this concept of active learning, where we embalm, if you like, creative thinking, disruptive innovation, and high-performance leadership in a short, quick course. We basically get people to reflect on their organisations and how they're innovating and change that. And we talk about this model of an ideas factory, creating an ideas centre within your own organisation, no matter how big, no matter how complex, and no matter how busy you are. And it helps generate new multidisciplinary collaborations even within your organisation. It helps develop new networks, learn new tools and skills for rapidly thinking out ideas. And the concept of thinking small about starting small and then thinking big about a problem or an issue. And then leading by example, not just within your organisation, but within the network of organisations that you deal with. And it's about changing the organisational culture, different ways of maybe of engaging at meetings, different ways of getting your staff to bring forward their ideas. So what we're really trying to do is drive our organisation to rapidly innovate. And we've been very successful at that, and through that we have a huge network of companies. This is not just within healthcare, but what we find is if you take people out of the area that they're familiar with, put them in another area, they can learn skills in core skills in innovation much faster, and then they can go back and they're prepared to apply them much better in their own environment. And this idea of the process and what I call the technology ecosystem, that if you are designing your product, if you're applying it, it isn't just the doctors, the nurses, it's the physiotherapists, it's the finance people. The concept of designing products should engage a whole range of people into the process, and sometimes smart people who don't even know the area at all can come up with really great ideas. So it's the idea of applying things like design thinking. So really, where it needs to go is not to rely on existing companies to come up with the right new products for patient care. Transferring innovative ideas into medicine can be challenging and expensive. I mentioned that particularly in relation to things like apps. Using innovation tools such as design thinking to engage interdisciplinary teams can help expedite the solutions to real problems. So basically creating a fertile environment for things to happen. And these teams should consist of a wide range of people from across the spectrum of the ecosystem, not just the healthcare professionals themselves. So that's it. You can find out more information about our breakout program on breakout.ie, or you can email us at info@breakout.ie. That's also useful. Thanks very much. Anybody, any questions?